In 200 BCE, the Han dynasty paid for its survival with bolts of silk. The Xiongnu nomadic confederation demanded tribute, and the Chinese treasury delivered in fabric. This was not a gift of luxury, but a strategic weapon of statecraft. A single bolt of silk could buy a horse, a soldier, or a temporary peace. The most delicate material on earth became the hardest currency of the ancient world. Yet the source of this power was a creature smaller than a human finger. How did a simple insect cocoon force empires to rewrite their borders? I mean, think about that for a second. It started in a quiet, humid forest long before the rise of the Han. Archaeologists found the first traces of silk at the Jiahu site in Henan province. These fragments date back to the Neolithic period, nearly 9,000 years ago. The Bombyx mori moth spun a single, continuous filament within its cocoon. This thread stretched between 600 and 900 meters in length. Early farmers discovered that boiling these cocoons released the long, shimmering fiber. The process demanded relentless, back-breaking labor. Women in rural households spent their lives tending to the voracious silkworms. They harvested mulberry leaves, cleaned trays, and monitored the delicate temperature of the shed. It was a cycle of production that left no room for rest. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. The Chinese state transformed this domestic craft into a brutal economic engine. Officials demanded taxes in the form of finished silk bolts. Families often fell into crushing debt when their silk quotas remained unfilled. The state calculated the value of land and livestock using these bolts as a unit of account. Silk became the physical manifestation of the imperial tax burden. By the time of the Han dynasty, the trade had expanded into a continental network. Zhang Qian, an imperial envoy, traveled across the unknown western regions. He sought alliances and brought back reports of distant markets hungry for Chinese goods. These routes eventually became the legendary Silk Road. The government enforced a total monopoly on the production of the fabric. Exporting silkworm eggs or mulberry seeds was a capital offense. Chinese guards patrolled the borders to keep the secret within the empire. They understood that the value of silk depended entirely on its scarcity. For centuries, the Mediterranean world received the finished cloth, but never the means to produce it. Romans paid fortunes in silver for a material they believed grew on trees. They had no concept of the Bombyx mori or the labor of the Chinese countryside. This monopoly finally shattered in the 6th century. Two Nestorian monks traveled to China under the cover of religious mission. They observed the secret process of harvesting the silkworm eggs. The monks took several thousand eggs and hid them deep inside hollow bamboo walking sticks. They carried these canes across the dangerous mountain passes of Central Asia. They delivered the eggs to the court of the Byzantine emperor, Justinian I. Justinian understood the geopolitical implications of this biological theft. He ordered the establishment of state-run workshops in the heart of Constantinople. The monopoly of the East evaporated in a single season. And this is where the story took a turn nobody expected. The Byzantine Empire turned the stolen secret into a massive industrial enterprise. Silk production moved from the forests of China to the Mediterranean workshops. The fabric that once bought the silence of nomadic tribes now funded the Byzantine state. The reality was far darker than the shimmering surface suggested. This shift did not liberate the workers. It merely moved the site of their exploitation. The state-run workshops relied on the same rigid, tax-burdened labor systems. Women and artisans continued to perform the repetitive, exhaustive tasks of sericulture. The production of silk remained an industry of forced output and state control. The value of the material remained tethered to the physical toil of the human hand. Every bolt of silk that left a workshop carried the weight of its origin. The trade had changed, but the cycle of extraction remained absolute. The Byzantine state enforced strict regulations on the new domestic industry. Imperial officials controlled every loom within the capital. They classified the production of high-grade silk as an exclusive royal prerogative. Workers toiled in damp, windowless rooms to ensure the humidity remained constant. The state-controlled workshops effectively turned the secret of the moth into a weapon of war. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. The demand for raw materials expanded beyond the borders of the empire. Merchant fleets navigated the Mediterranean to secure steady supplies of mulberry leaves. They established massive plantations in Greece and the Levant. The landscape shifted as farmers replaced food crops with rows of mulberry trees. Local populations faced sudden shortages of grain and essential foodstuffs. The prioritize of silk over survival created widespread famine in rural provinces. Peasants abandoned their villages as the tax burden became impossible to sustain. They sold their labor to the imperial workshops for a pittance. The cycle of extraction moved from the east to the heart of Europe. Wealthy aristocrats in Constantinople wore robes that required the labor of dozens of weavers. These garments weighed several pounds due to the heavy gold thread woven into the silk. They signaled absolute power in a society defined by extreme hierarchy. The church also claimed a portion of the production. Priests draped altars in heavy, patterned silk to display the sanctity of the empire. Every fiber in those tapestries represented weeks of grueling, repetitive labor. The reality was far darker than the vibrant colors suggested. By the 11th century, the center of production shifted once again. The Normans invaded the Greek regions and captured the skilled weavers. They seized the looms and transported the artisans to Sicily. King Roger II of Sicily established a royal workshop in Palermo. He treated the captured weavers as state property, not as free citizens. They lived under armed guard to prevent the secret from leaking to other kingdoms. The technology of silk production became a prize of war for every ambitious monarch. Italy emerged as the new capital of the European silk trade. Cities like Lucca and Venice built their fortunes on the refined techniques stolen from the East. They mechanized the process using water-powered mills. These mills increased output tenfold, but shattered the lives of the workers. The machines required constant attention in dangerous, high-speed environments. Fingers were crushed between the wooden gears of the throwing frames. The stench of the boiling vats permeated the narrow streets of the city. The wealth generated by these mills funded the construction of marble palaces. Venetian merchants dominated the trade routes across the continent. They shipped the finished cloth to the royal courts of France and England. The fabric that once bought peace from the Xiongnu now fueled the Renaissance. It funded the painters, the architects, and the bankers of the Italian city-states. The mundane cocoon of the moth had completely restructured the European economy. Yet the danger to the producer remained constant. The industry required a massive, compliant workforce to function. Plantation owners and factory masters relied on strict, often violent oversight. They kept the workers in debt to prevent them from fleeing the looms. The legacy of the silk industry was a trail of exploited labor across 3 continents. It transformed the map of the world through the demand for a single insect's secretion. The fabric that appeared soft to the touch felt like iron to the people who made it. This was the hidden cost of the global desire for luxury. The cycle of production continued unabated for centuries. It survived the fall of empires and the rise of new economic systems. The demand for silk never truly vanished from the halls of power. It simply found new ways to extract value from the vulnerable. The history of the material was not one of beauty or art. It was a history of relentless, state-sanctioned transformation. And this is where the story took a turn nobody expected. Industrialization in the 19th century replaced the handloom with the power loom. Factories in Lyon and Paterson produced silk at an unprecedented scale. The price dropped, and the fabric became accessible to a wider demographic. Yet the conditions inside the factories grew increasingly hazardous. Workers labored in extreme heat to keep the silk filaments from snapping. They inhaled dust and chemical dyes that caused long-term health decline. The industry moved to the American South in a failed attempt to replicate the climate. Farmers planted millions of mulberry trees in a desperate bid for profit. The project collapsed when the labor costs proved too high to sustain. The moth remained a biological anomaly that defied easy industrialization. Its life cycle required a level of human care that machines could not provide. The human hand remained the final, essential tool of the industry. Everything returned to the same ancient, back-breaking labor. The empire of the moth was built on the backs of the invisible. The Tang dynasty turned the fabric into a weapon of statecraft. Silk bolts became the primary currency of the imperial treasury. Officials measured the value of land and livestock in these shimmering lengths. A single bolt measured 40 centimeters wide and 12 meters long. Emperors used this standardized unit to secure the borders of the realm. They sent massive shipments to foreign emissaries as tribute diplomacy. This flow of silk purchased the loyalty of regional leaders. It maintained stability across the vast, shifting frontier. But the burden fell directly onto the rural household. Tax collectors demanded silk from families living in the provinces. Women labored for months to meet the impossible quotas. They harvested leaves and tended the silkworms in darkened rooms. Families fell into crushing debt when the harvests failed to meet the state mandate. The value of the empire relied on the hunger of the peasant. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. The secret of the moth eventually bled out of the east. Knowledge of the filaments traveled across the desert trade routes. The Byzantine Empire broke the ancient monopoly in the 6th century. Justinian I established state-run workshops within the walls of Constantinople. He turned the secret into a pillar of Mediterranean power. The industry remained a prize for every ambitious monarch in the West. In 1147, the Normans launched a naval campaign against the Greeks. King Roger II of Sicily commanded his fleet to strike Corinth and Thebes. His soldiers seized the looms and the master weavers. They dragged the artisans from their homes in the heart of the Byzantine silk trade. The conquerors transported the captives to the island of Sicily. Roger II settled the weavers in a royal workshop in Palermo. He placed them under armed guard to preserve their technical knowledge. The secret of the loom became a permanent asset of the Norman state. This forced migration shifted the center of production to Western Europe. The technology evolved under the control of Italian city-states. Venice and Lucca mechanized the process with water-powered mills. They used the stolen techniques to dominate the European market. Wealth flowed into the Mediterranean from the northern courts. The fabric that once pacified the Xiongnu now funded the Renaissance. But the industry required constant expansion to sustain its profits. By the 15th century, the French crown sought to capture this wealth. King Louis XI viewed the outflow of gold as a national threat. He established the silk industry in the city of Lyon. The king imported Italian weavers to train a local workforce. He mandated the planting of mulberry trees across the French countryside. The landscape changed to accommodate the hunger of the moth. Farmers abandoned grain crops to satisfy the royal demand. The rural population faced food shortages as the silk trade expanded. Louis XI used the industry to centralize his own economic power. He transformed a luxury trade into a tool of French mercantilism. The state controlled the flow of raw material and finished goods. Every worker in the Lyon workshops functioned as a cog in this machine. The reality was far darker than the vibrant colors suggested. The industry required a massive, compliant workforce to function. Plantation owners and factory masters relied on strict, often violent oversight. They kept the workers in debt to prevent them from fleeing the looms. The legacy of the silk industry was a trail of exploited labor across 3 continents. It transformed the map of the world through the demand for a single insect's secretion. The fabric that appeared soft to the touch felt like iron to the people who made it. This was the hidden cost of the global desire for luxury. The cycle of production continued unabated for centuries. It survived the fall of empires and the rise of new economic systems. The demand for silk never truly vanished from the halls of power. It simply found new ways to extract value from the vulnerable. The history of the material was not one of beauty or art. It was a history of relentless, state-sanctioned transformation. They inhaled dust and chemical dyes that caused long-term health decline. The industry moved to the American South in a failed attempt to replicate the climate. Farmers planted millions of mulberry trees in a desperate bid for profit. The project collapsed when the labor costs proved too high to sustain. The moth remained a biological anomaly that defied easy industrialization. Its life cycle required a level of human care that machines could not provide. The human hand remained the final, essential tool of the industry. Everything returned to the same ancient, back-breaking labor. The empire of the moth was built on the backs of the invisible. The French crown enforced a strict monopoly over the Lyon workshops. Royal inspectors patrolled the floors to ensure no silk left without a state stamp. They confiscated any loom operating outside the king's official guild. The price of raw silk plummeted as the state flooded the market with domestic product. Farmers in the Rhone Valley tore out their ancestral vines to plant mulberry orchards. The landscape turned into a monoculture of leaves for the hungry silkworms. Hunger spread through the villages as the fields stopped producing bread. Peasants traded their last bags of wheat for the privilege of raising worms. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. The shift created a dependency that left the French countryside vulnerable to the slightest blight. In the mid-19th century, a microscopic parasite arrived in the mulberry groves. The protozoan known as pebrine attacked the silkworms in their dark, humid nurseries. The insects turned black and withered in their cocoons. The entire industry in Lyon ground to a sudden, silent halt. Master weavers stood before empty looms as the supply of thread evaporated overnight. Factory owners shuttered the doors and abandoned the machinery to the rust. The French state scrambled to find a solution to the biological collapse. Scientists and naturalists swarmed the remaining healthy farms to isolate the contagion. Louis Pasteur arrived in the region to study the dying insects. He peered through his microscope at the calcified remains of the larvae. He discovered that the infection passed from the mother moth to the egg. The realization forced a total redesign of the production cycle. Inspectors moved into every workshop to examine the eggs under glass lenses. They destroyed thousands of batches to prevent the spread of the disease. The human element of production became a clinical, sterilized operation. The industry survived the blight, but the nature of the labor changed. It was no longer a craft of the artisan. It became a controlled experiment in biological management. The demand for the final fabric remained higher than ever in the global market. Wealthy consumers in London and New York demanded the finest, smoothest weaves. Factories in New Jersey and Pennsylvania attempted to scale up the production. They imported millions of eggs from the infected zones of Europe and Asia. The American silk boom promised to make the United States a global leader. Investors poured capital into massive, multi-story mills along the Patterson Falls. Engineers harnessed the power of the Passaic River to drive the spinning frames. Thousands of women moved from the rural farms to work the deafening machines. They stood for 12 hours a day in the humid, windowless factory air. The heat was necessary to keep the delicate filaments from snapping under tension. The dust from the raw silk clogged the lungs of every worker in the room. The machines demanded constant, frantic attention to prevent the thread from tangling. Fingers were routinely mangled in the iron rollers of the spinning frames. Management kept the pace relentless to maximize the output of every spool. The finished silk traveled by rail to the luxury boutiques of the world. It sat on display in velvet-lined cases as a symbol of modernity and grace. The people who wore the fabric never saw the scars of the workers. They never smelled the damp, rotting odors of the breeding rooms. The history of the material remained hidden behind the luster of the weave. The moth had conquered the industrial world by turning humans into its primary caretakers. It required the total reorganization of entire societies to exist at this scale. The global economy had tied its growth to the life cycle of a single, fragile insect, and the cost of that growth continued to be paid in human health and labor. The cycle of production was now locked into a permanent, unsustainable trajectory. The machines groaned under the weight of the endless global demand. The looms of the industrial age stood as monuments to a biological master. Millions of Bombyx mori cocoons fed the insatiable hunger of Western markets. Each single filament measured up to 900 meters in length. Workers pulled these microscopic threads through boiling water to dissolve the protective gum. This process required constant, precise attention from human hands. Machines could spin, but they could not nurture the living organism. The scale of production demanded a reorganization of human life. Families in the Rhone Valley abandoned food crops for mulberry orchards. Fields once used for wheat became monocultures of leaves. Villages faced starvation when the price of raw silk fluctuated. The state prioritized the currency of silk over the sustenance of its people. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. The parasite known as pebrine arrived in the mid-19th century. Microscopic protozoa infected the larvae in their humid nurseries. The insects turned black and withered inside their cocoons. Industry experts faced a sudden, silent collapse of supply. Louis Pasteur peered through his microscope at the calcified remains. He identified the contagion within the mother moth and the egg. The realization forced a total redesign of the production cycle. Inspectors moved into workshops to examine every batch under glass lenses. They destroyed thousands of infected eggs to prevent the spread of disease. The craft of the artisan vanished into the logic of biological management. Factories in New Jersey and Pennsylvania attempted to scale the output. Investors harnessed the Passaic River to drive massive spinning frames. Thousands of women labored in windowless, humid mills. The air hung heavy with the dust of raw silk. Management kept the pace relentless to maximize the yield of every spool. Fingers were routinely mangled in the iron rollers of the machines. The finished fabric traveled by rail to the luxury boutiques of the world. It sat on display in velvet-lined cases, a symbol of modern grace. The consumers never saw the scars of the workers in the mills. They never smelled the damp, rotting odors of the breeding rooms. The history of the material remained hidden behind the luster of the weave. The moth had conquered the industrial world by turning humans into caretakers. It required the total reorganization of entire societies to exist at this scale. The global economy tied its growth to the life cycle of one insect. The cost of that growth was paid in human health and labor. The cycle of production was locked into a permanent, unsustainable trajectory. The machines groaned under the weight of an endless, global demand. Silk remains the product of a system that commodified life itself. You wear the history of that exploitation against your own skin today. The thread that connected the ancient Han dynasty to your closet is still pulling tight. You are the final consumer in a chain of misery that never actually broke. The moth is still hungry, and you are still part of its empire.